Welcoming everyone to the very early round quarterfinals of Atma Open 2020. Congratulations for everyone making it this far. It's indeed a fantastic achievement. May I please invite panelists to introduce themselves very quickly? Just mention your name and share your preferred gender pronoun, please, starting from Bastri.
My name is Astri. I actually don't really care what to be called, so whatever.
Sure. Felix?
My name is Felix. Preferred gender pronoun he or they.
Thank you, and please refer to me as he or they. Name's Upi. May I please just really quickly for the speakers, starting from OG?
Stephanie, TM, she or they.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Rifan, DPM, he or they.
Thank you. Ella, opening opposition.
Hi, I'm Fahri. Will be the leader of opposition. Gender pronoun he or him.
Thank you, sir. Yellow.
Hi, my name is Garda, LO. Preferred pronoun he or they.
Okay, wait, Garde, you're going to be speaking first, right?
Oh, no, I'm going to be speaking second.
And okay, so DLO that is. Okay, fine.
DLO, sorry.
Thank you. Closing government?
Leon, member of government, sure day.
That's Leon, yeah, I believe. Was that Leon or Balkis?
Yes, that's
that
Leon.
was
Sorry.
I
Leon,
thought she speak for both.
Good. Sure. Whip.
Yeah, Balkis, she or they.
Thank you. Closing opposition.
Hanum speaking first, she or they.
Thanks. Whip.
Shagung speaking second. No, gender pronouns.
Fantastic. All right. We'll just ask everyone to abide by that preferred gender pronoun. Just several housekeeping rules. Number one is that please use the chat function of Zoom to offer any POIs as a default mode. If any speaker wants to have any other preference like video or audio for preferred method of POIs being offered to them, feel free to indicate them in the beginning of your speech. Number two, possibly someone's going to be timing either Bastri or Felix, but if not, that's completely okay too. I'm going to encourage everyone to also use your own timer because Debate Keeper is a fantastic app that you can download very easily. So feel free to do so as well, just so that you know when the protected minute ends in the first minute and begins again the 6th minute. Speaking time is still 7 minutes as usual. And finally, hopefully nothing happens with regards to connection, Zoom, everything glitching, IndieHome, all that fuckeries that happens within our world of developing countries. Hopefully nothing goes on though, fingers crossed. But if something happens, we'll work it out as we go. So hopefully all go swimmingly. So I think we're good to go for the quarterfinal round. Under the motion that reads, let me just open this up, close this. Under a fixed capitalist structure, this house as an average member of the middle class would aggressively pursue materialism. I'd like to invite Prime Minister, I believe that's Stephanie, to speak, please.
Very
Yes.
short, because I will be timing. So if you guys are using a timekeeper and timing whatnot, keep it silent. So the ding is only from me, okay?
Yeah, or you can also just type it here on the chat, but just like one minute, it'll just type like that.
Okay.
Yeah, so
I
that
will
there's
do
no audio
both.
intrusion.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, Stephanie, whenever you're ready. Thanks.
Am I audible?
Good.
Okay. The capitalist trope is one that subjugates an individual to a life where the acquisition of capital is at its center. And as middle income earners, we ought to fully embrace that purpose, even if it comes at the expense of one's personal passion or sense of morality, for instance. Two-part model on my case before I move on to my argumentation. Firstly, quite obvious here, we will be pursuing material needs, which means things like accumulated wealth, property ownership, money to use to buy materials like cars, anything that could make you happy, right? We would pursue this through doing things like working hard to take, for instance, a corporate job, as opposed to even if your passion lies in an NGO job, for instance. This will come in conjunction to the comparative, which are likely non-commercial passions, like NGO work, like I said, which could be pursuing things like art or music, even though you might probably never be famous, where they gain very, very little money, right? Or very little material, but you get to pursue maybe your passion. Or even comparisons like having harmonious families, but being poor because you see them every day instead of working, even though you live under poverty with your family. This is the comparative. Second part is what we mean by aggressively pursue. We think that in this world we live is driven by competition, right? For instance, Bitcoin crashes within a single day. The stock market can fluctuate billions of dollars in the time that we're having this debate right now. The idea is the capitalist world is competitive, right? I'll talk more about this later. But the competition, the alternative is either you detach yourself from the capitalist world, which is near impossible. I'm glad to see OP try to defend this and how they would defend this. Or OP could say that you continue to inevitably participate in the capitalist world, but you pursue a very mediocre life, or probably work under like a boss, or continuously pay your rent payments to your landlords, things like that. Very mediocre. You have to choose to not compete. You choose to survive, which means you pursue a life of mediocrity. You could try to actualize other ways, like spending time with your family, but you have to defend how you can continue to be happy and continue to self-actualize while you live side by side to your starving mother and your disappointed father. A life of mediocrity means a life where you inevitably do have to constantly care about money still, to the extent that your survival still depends on the involvement of the capitalist institutions to work and purchase food and housing. Alternatively, OP could defend wanting to die, which I'm interested to see them doing if they want to do that. Two arguments then. First of all, why you are likely to be able to rise up the ladder as a middle income earner. And second of all, the alternative, things like morality, things like an alternative life, right?
Question.
So first, capitalist system, no thanks. Capitalism is middle class friendly, though not poor friendly. So it's highly possible for the middle class to actually climb up the socioeconomic ladder. Three things here. First is that where free market has adequate intervention of the state, it's middle income earners that benefits from this, even through government programs like welfare, right? Capitalism cannot make an extremely poor country grow. Almost all fastest growing economies are beneficiaries of capitalism, including Southeast Asia or African countries. This is because the flow of capital only exists in these states. Almost all of them gets injection of capital from private entities. With capitalism, private entities can inject capital for these countries to actually grow. And yes, the richest will benefit from this. So does the middle class, though. This is exactly why countries like Rwanda and Indonesia have robust middle class, right? The primary ways we think middle income earners can rise up the ladder, right? So we think that first, through ways like managerial work is occupied by members of the middle class. Skill-based work that can yield tons of capital, like trading, is also occupied predominantly by the middle class workers. White-collar degrees and opportunities are generally allocated to the middle class. These are mechanisms that exist in the capitalist state specifically to cater to the middle class people to rise. But second of all, in order for the richest to actually become richer, they need to co-opt the middle class for things like different skill sets, etc., in order to actually acquire capital. And middle class will likely be embraced by the rich. The issue is that people are disillusioned in the oppression of middle class, where you compare your life to the richest individuals, whereas if you compare yourself to the general bell curve and the general public of the population, you'll adjust your standard of living. At best, this pursuance is temporary. If you're so keen to pursue your passions fully, it's likely the case that when you retire or reach a full level of comfort, you're far more able to self-actualize in your passions. But thirdly here is the comparative life, right? Other types of happiness do exist, but it's far harder to actually reach. It's likely that your personal interest is also consumerist at best, right? Popular culture are hedonistic and incredibly consumerist, and it's injected that idea that you, to have a life of fulfillment, you have to engage in the capitalist state. Alternatives of material views are non-existent in society. Other values are hijacked already by capitalism. For instance, if you choose to participate in charity work, it becomes philanthrocapitalism. For instance, buy one, get one donated, etc. It's entrenched in this capitalist state to actually pursue your other passions. Even if you want to live peacefully in a faraway land, for instance, those things are also hijacked by capitalism, in that housing markets and companies have entered into those areas. In order to get food every single day, you have to purchase food from a nearby grocery store. This means that there is zero way for you to actually pursue a life free from capitalism, and it's almost impossible that you self-actualize elsewhere if you and detach from capitalism. Even to communicate to each other, you have to do it through phones or Instagram or Twitter, where Apple and Facebook or Instagrams gets massive sponsorship from corporate ads that will directly inject into your phone, and therefore you believe personally that you probably would be most fulfilled if you pursue a life of capitalism. This is the best way of self-actualization. Be materialistic. Second argument then is the alternative. You might harm the poorest. The rich gets richer, the middle class climbs up, the poorest suffer. Fine. Three things though. First, it's not an injustice, rather a tragedy. Injustice only happens when you personally will violate the rule of law or the rule of capitalism, but you're not violating the rule of law here, right? Unless private property is a crime or morally abhorrent, then you might be doing harm. You're not. So we think there is no moral corruption on your personal part, rather a tragedy of the system that already exists and that subjugates the poor. But second, this acts as a mechanism of self-defense, right? It's impossible to fight against the system, so you have to survive in this cruel system. The only way to survive is to aggressively pursue something that everyone tells you is your only means to self-actualize. Survival is only through self-actualization, and you can only do that through participating aggressively in the capitalist state. But third here is that if we live a normal life, we will immediately lose out on competition, right? Notice my framing. There's a consequence of vulnerability for the middle class. This means that even though you can rise up, you can also rank down and you can also fall into poverty. If you live a normal life and try to rent, you're going to be subjected to bad landlords who might evict you at any point of time. If you live a sucky life where you want to earn middle income, right, you are subjugated to a 9-to-5 job with your shitty boss, right? Getting an okay job means you're subjected to this type of strict scheduling, right? Not pursuing a degree from college means you're unable to access goods and services on any part. To the extent that OG proves to you that the inevitability of capitalism means that you ought to aggressively pursue capital, we win this debate. Proud to propose.
All right, fantastic. Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for that speech. To opening opposition's case, I'd like to invite Leader of Opposition, I believe that's Fahri, to speak, please. You're here.
Can you give me a few seconds? I'm gonna take my timer.
Sure. And just as a note for POIs, just please use the chat. So I'm just going to reiterate that, unless the speaker indicates other preferences for POIs, please, so that we have minimum audio intrusion into the speaker. And for this speech, Fahri, you're not going to use a video, right? So I'm going to turn off mine, yeah?
Okay.
Sure. Whenever you're ready.
Okay. I think middle class workers are not those who are currently live below the poverty line, right? Middle class are those who already have enough to live, but sometimes still worry about another day, right? So what they are talking about, how people should pursue their happiness without, by being very, very poor. We don't necessarily think that's the case in this debate. Our stance in opening oppositions is that we pursue mediocrity, right? We say that it's okay for you to become regular Joe, and we take the trade-off that some of you might not get the passion that you currently have. That means that, you might just have an office work and you still be okay with it. You find happiness in what you have right now. We think those are the kind of pursuit happiness that we want to have on our side of the house. A pursuit of happiness that is detached from material, that you don't need property for you to be happy, right? But notice, one clarification, that we still have the pursuit of material, but it was just to have survivability and to be sustainable. What does it mean? It means that even in the current capitalist structure, you are already forced to participate in it. You are already forced to work in offices, for instance, to go to education, that in the end of the day, even if you go to ITB, you go to architecture major, you might still work in a bank, for instance, and not pursue your passion. And we say that's perfectly fine. We think that that's perfectly fine, right? Because our stance is that it's unfair for you, and it will be harmful even for you to have this pursuit of material as the middle class workers. With that said, I'm gonna bring two arguments. First, why then it is unfair for why then it's going to be unfair for the middle class? But secondly, how does this will give you a sense of fulfillment? All rebuttals will be integrated, right? So first, why does it's unfair? Notice that on their side of the house, they try to frame this as saying that, we're just going to work hard, right? But the question then becomes, would that work hard brings something, right? Because we think that you can gain the ability of you gaining more material or gaining more cars and so on and so forth. These are the kind of thing that is very, very arbitrary and very random. Therefore, that's why it's ultimately unfair, because your success is not based on the hard work that you have, but a big part of it might be your privilege. A big part of it might be the connection that you have. A big part of it is the luckiness that you currently have. So we think that it's very unfair for you to put your happiness, put the well-being of your mental state or the purpose of your life into something that is very, very arbitrary, right? But notice how even currently you are competing with literary people who have more privilege, with literary people who have better education, or currently you're even competing with AI, because currently AI already can do things such as managing, for instance, doing your economy and so on and so forth, right? That's why we think it's unfair for you to say that middle class workers should pursue something that only a few people can then, in the end of the day, grab the benefit of it. With that said, I'm gonna move on to my second argument on why on the sense of fulfillment, right? We think this is very important. Why? Because currently, so many people are anxious about their condition, and this is not necessarily good, because sense of fulfillment means that you're already being okay with your conditions. We think that's what a healthy society should be. We think that that's the moment when they become productive. We think that's the moment when the quality of life of our society is good. Three layers to these arguments. First, why material is toxic, and uh, and secondly, why then it's going to harm the middle class, and thirdly, how then a detached pursuit of happiness is going to bring full sense of fulfillment, right? So first, on why then the material is toxic. Three layers to this. First, we think that it's going to be never ending. What does it mean? It means that there's always going to be something more that you have to gain in the materialistic world. Exactly because we are living in a very, very capitalist system, meaning that they will always sell you something. They will always sell you new innovations, even if it's very small. Just take a look at iPhones, for instance. They just upgrade it a little bit and increase and jack up the price like crazy, right? Therefore, material will always be never ending. But secondly, notice how our current society is so high with comparison. I'm talking about how you keep sharing on social media, how you keep comparing yourself with your friends who have more material, for instance, and in the end of the day, exactly because it was all luck and it was all the privilege that they have, you will never be fulfilled with what you have because of this comparison that the capitalist structure that forces us. So we want like what other people want, ladies and gentlemen. That's why these kind of comparison with Indian is toxic. But third of all, right, you most likely cannot enjoy these you are most likely cannot enjoy these certain things. We think the worst case scenario is that they are going to gain the same material as our side of the house. Why? Because exactly the current structure are forcing you to do your work anyway, right? No matter how much you work, no matter how much hard work that you put in it, most likely you're going to gain the same, exactly because no one is because if you don't have the privilege, if you don't have the luckiness to have that, you won't gain it anyway. But in a best case, you cannot enjoy those material, because when they say that you need capital to have a sense of fulfillment, we think that's exactly what's wrong. Because right now, when you become workaholic, your mental well-being becomes very, very bad, because all you think about is not the enjoyment of the property that you gain, but rather the pursuit of that property in itself. That means that for you to, as a middle class, for you to sustain that kind of behavior, you cannot enjoy the property that you buy. You cannot enjoy the life that your current family have, for instance. That's why we think that's going to be very harmful, right? But why? But secondly, why does this harm the middle class? We think that's most likely the moment you become aggressive is the moment you're desperate for cash, for instance, the moment you invest in more risky things that are such as irrational, in investing in startup. Exactly why Bitcoin crashes and people invest in it, exactly because they're aggressive in creating more capital in the end of the day. That's why it's most likely going to be harmful. But lastly, why then the detached pursuit of happiness is going to be far better? Two key reasons. First, we think that individually you can be happy because there are smaller goals that are more feasible for you to achieve. With these feasible goals that you can achieve, that's how you then get the sense of fulfillment, right? But secondly, the culture inside of the community, exactly when they say that there's going to be competitions and so on, exactly because you are currently competing with other middle class workers, exactly your parents are disappointed because what our current culture is, you should pursue more material, ladies and gentlemen. So when the moment that we remove this culture is the moment where competitions is no longer toxic, it's no longer to take down other people, and with all those reasons we're very proud to oppose.
All right, fantastic. Thank you very much for the Leader of Opposition for that speech. And before moving to the Deputy Prime Minister, just like to encourage everyone to use video, and I'm going to turn on mine again. And if anyone is able to turn on their videos, they're encouraged to, just because this is going to be streamed on Facebook. And I think it'd be good for optics. And yes, nice. Fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone, for that. But I do understand if there's anyone with connection, so please flag it out if you don't feel comfortable or if you have connection issues.
Note for Fahri, considering that this is live stream in Facebook, please avoid offensive and sensitive background again. Thank you. For public consumption, Fahri.
He has history of doing that, guys.
Prevent you backlash. Absolutely fantastic. All right. I think we're ready for the Deputy Prime Minister, so I'm inviting that speaker. I think it's Rifan to speak, please. Here.
Am I audible? Okay, so just make a disclaimer. I'm not sure that my internet connection will be stable. I still turn on the video, but if it turns out bakal lagging, please let me know so I might resort to solutions of turning it off. Okay?
Sure.
Yeah. And for anyone who want to ask POI, just unmute and ask for POIs through video. That will be a lot easier for me to notice.
Apply for that speaker, please. Noted.
I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. Member of the House, the major problems of the opening opposition is definitely the clarity of the case. I think Stephanie has been helping all the opposition bench as well as judges for the alternatives of the world that we imagine, either to pursue non-commercial passions, for example, being in the artist, or working for NGOs, or building cooperatives that might not be profitable in a capitalist world, or survive in mediocre capitalist structures but prioritize other things such as family, such as harmony with their spouses, and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, none of the portrayals of the opening oppositions here is clear. Why do you think that pursuit of the mediocre life or detaching yourself from capitalism will make a happier life? What type of happier life did you envision? And why do you think that the alternatives of happier life that is non-material is possible, especially when the capitalist structures has been hijacking most of these ideas, be it being charitable to other people, being kind to other people, or even making sure that you create a harmonious family? All of those things are not provided, which means that most of those my Prime Minister's arguments standing. Before proceeding to my extension, I will submit several rebuttals to the Leader of Opposition. Fahri says that the problems of our arguments is that our arguments might be morally problematic because it's oftentimes unfair for middle class. Why? Because the problems of the lottery of birth, some of them might not be born handsome, might not be born with good network. Hence, they might face difficulties in order for them to gain aggressive material pursuit in capitalist structure. Yes, but for me, my answer is simple. For middle class, we are not the victim of birth lottery, rather the beneficiaries of birth lottery. Middle class oftentimes get the most access to bona fide public school. We are the closest to the top richest as capital owners, so we are able to get opportunity in receiving our fruit of labor. Your argument may only work for the poorest, but it's within the interest of the middle class to prioritize their happiness and their survival over the general benefit for the poor to just climb up ladder. So in this situation, lottery of birth is actually our benefit rather than our loss. Leader of Opposition also argues that the problems of aggressively pursued material needs is that material needs will be never ending. For example, we are keep demanded to change our iPhones every three months, and the price of iPhones is hijacked by capitalists to be extremely expensive in comparisons of the cost of goods sold. There are two responses here. Number one, the fact that material is never ending in capitalist structure is a good indication that capitalism is middle class friendly. It is within the capitalist interest to accumulate wealth, which means that capitalists needs to keep production and give reasons for consumers to afford. They build a value of happiness, they build the value of lifestyles, and all of these things give us reasons to change our iPhone every single 6 months. Hence, the middle class become the chunk of the market. So we are loved by capitalists. We are appreciated high if we work in managerial work, for example, in order for us to purchase and spend our salaries for the capitalists to get to continue their production and to continue the cycle of the capital flow. Therefore, we think that middle class will be preferred more rather than being hated. After my second rebuttals. Secondly, material pursuit might end after we reach age of 50 or 60, for example. But this only happens if we receive two things. One, a reliable financial security, which demand us to continuously aggressively pursue material needs when we are productive. Why? Because most of the insurance costs will be jacked up even after we get 40. Even in the systems of unit link and the systems of in the systems of deposits, which means that we need to continuously pursue it, because if we stop and we only pursue a mediocre life, our financial security will not be ever enough. Secondly, we get mature by not comparing our lives to Bill Gates, but rather comparing our lives to surrounding middle class. This requires maturity, and of course, the process to get maturity requires time, but it is far more reachable rather than us being trapped into just comparing ourselves to the top richest that is not the bell curve of the population. Yes.
We agree with your assertion that the rich embrace the middle class and make them have a somewhat happy life. But isn't it because the middle class have been so content and so mediocre? And what happens in your world when the middle class actually want to become the rich, they aggressively pursue it? Won't that actually make the rich revolt against them?
No, the rich will not revolt against them, because in many developing countries, only an anomaly of middle class can be the top richest. Some of them cannot be the top richest, but it's not because the capitalists hate them. It's because the capitalists want to keep them into the middle class. And I think the middle class will came into a conclusion that they will be content to be a middle class. But in order to be a middle class, they need to aggressively pursue. Because if you become mediocre, you will lose out the competition. If you sleep for a day and do not see at your Bitcoin report, your portfolio might crash. And that's the reason why material pursuit aggressively is important. Moving on to my extension. Can middle class survive the consequences of aggressive material pursuit? Aggressive material pursuit might suffer from numerous costs and consequences because we have limited physical and mental endurances. And our material pursuit that demand us to work relentlessly, to keep cautious about someone that might ripping you off, or thinking whether or not you secure financial insurance and enough emergency funding, will be damaging for you, might have consequences for you. So without being naive, we would like to be fair here in this debate, that we've seen examples that those who want to undergo depression, find hard to pursue committed relationship, and declining life expectancy due to terminally ill risk. However, I'm going to prove you why, even with all these consequences, aggressively pursued material needs are worth it, based on two reasons. One, all the damages and consequences are unfortunately inevitable even after we detach materialist pursuit. If your children are having fever, almost all healthcare are not universal, even in the richest country of the world, which is named United States of America. That's why you require to have enormous amount of money just to make sure that your family is still in touch. If your passionate artwork is good, but not being patented and being taken away by high-end fashion brands such as Louis Vuitton, you will be able to lose your ability to self-express and actual yourselves, and hence being participating and patenting, which of course have a huge cost, is the consequences of it. And litigating them burden us to have enormous amount of money for affording lawyer, which then again means an indication that your cost and your problems will still be happening even if you do not pursue aggressive material needs. Secondly, we also think that if you go and undergo depressions, the cost of undergoing therapy is extremely expensive, and we do not ever think that you will be able to escape from this. The conclusion of this aggressive material pursuit is worth it, and we propose.
All right, thank you very much for Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. And to close the opening half, I'm inviting Deputy Leader of Opposition. I think that's Garda to speak, please. You're here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Garda. I'll be speaking as the Deputy Leader of Opposition. My preferred method of POI is through just direct communication because I don't look at the chats here. So
Sure.
I'd like to ask maybe 5 seconds to structure my notes a bit. Okay. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. I'd like to structure my speech into 4 parts. Number 1, I'd like to re-clarify a bit on our stance. Number 2, I'd like to directly engage with their clash on the morality and the fairness of the effort of aggressively pursuing material wealth. Number 3, I'd like to talk about what is important and urgent for middle class, and finally talk about what is the tendencies of middle class, and do we actually need to aggressively pursue as a method of coping and self-defense. Number 1, I'd like to clarify our stance because I think it was a bit unclear from the opening government side, but I think we have been consistent. Flackery has been consistent that our stance, what we want the middle class to do is to keep not pursuing not pursuing materialistic lifestyle, but to pursue a life of mediocrity, And why is that fair? Because we feel that in the context of an inevitable capitalistic structure, mediocrity is okay. Why? Because I'll explain further in my arguments, right? Firstly, I'm going to talk more about the clash of morality and whether or not the fight of aggressive pursuing is fair or not, right? Firstly, they argue that the lottery of birth is actually that it is not unfair because living as a middle class in an inevitable capitalist structure is actually fair and actually beneficial for them because the lottery of birth is beneficial towards middle class, right? We feel that this actually, despite the lottery of birth and despite a lot of rich people actually liking the middle class because they contribute towards their richness, we feel that there is still a lot of random factors that happen within a capitalist society. And we feel that that factor of randomness it still needs to be taken into account. What is that factor of randomness? There is still the chance you can still lose hundreds of thousands of dollars just because you overslept and you did not see what the price of Bitcoin was at the end of the day, right? And we feel that the existence of this random choice, random variables, such as the existence of someday AI can suddenly rise up and actually replace your job, the existence someday a global pandemic can actually come up and make your very lucrative job suddenly non-existent, is actually something that an external harm that can cause a lot of suffering, especially towards individuals that are aggressively pursuing materialistic wealth, right? Secondly, I'm going to talk about what is the actual needs of the middle class at the end of the day and why we think a pursuit of mediocrity is okay, right? We'd actually like to argue using the context brought by the opening government themselves, right? They try to argue, they brought the assertion that the middle class is actually not that poor and that actually the rich are beneficiaries of the middle class and that they actually benefit from later on from actually having birth lottery and from actually being middle class, right? But we actually like to argue that the reason why the middle class is being a beneficiary of the capitalistic structure is because of that they're content to begin with, right? We feel that as a middle class, the moment that we actually allow significant amount of middle class to actually want to pursue a level of richness beyond middle class, that is the moment that the benefits that the opening government even brought to begin with is going to be reduced, because at the end of the day, what makes what makes the rising tide lift all the boats, what makes the people on the top have the incentive to want to actually give back, because they know at the end of the day, when being middle class people are capable of being content, right? Now, moving on about what is the actual needs of middle class, right? I'm going to go a bit more deeper and I'm going to talk more about actually the paradoxical nature of human thought itself, right? We feel that one of the interesting things about being human is that we are both capable of having infinite amount of wants, but we are also equally as capable of being content with whatever we have. That is actually proven in how I can spend a day just coding a very, very random website, not for any monetary value, and still feel okay. That's maybe a personal example, but we still have a lot of people being content, living in a modest life, just praying to God, and we feel that that is okay. And that actually proves just how to the extent of how people can still rationalize with their current situation. And we feel how to best assess what is the best mindset to have is we need to imagine what kind of world do we want to live in, a world in which we actually actively pursue that side of human being, which is able to actually self-sustain themselves with their own thoughts, or the side of human beings that aggressively wants newer and much more better things. We feel that the world is going to be better on our side. Why? Because in a world where everyone is content, then everyone has more tendency to be empathetic towards one another, because they will no longer focus on what they want, but what on other people do not have, right? And before I move on, yes, Rifan?
If the alternative of religious life right now is currently dominated with prosperity gospel as well as gold-coated mosque for you to get your spiritual needs, why do you think that religious alternative is not going to be able to be antithetical towards material needs?
I think that I'd like to also clarify that we are still okay with gold-coated mosques. And for example, if people still equate their religious needs with also materialistic wealth, right? Because at the end of the day, it does not matter if at the end of the day, the reason you do charity is because you want to feel good about yourself, or that even if you do live as a turnip farmer in a faraway village, you still go to malls and the supermarket, right? But what we are advocating against is the belief that the only source of value is through accumulating as much wealth as you can, and through making your mosque gold, which is not really the main focus when you're a religious person to begin with, right? As a religious person, we feel that you do not really care that much whether or not your mosque is gold coated. You just care whether or not you pray you pray holistically to God, and that you feel a connection to God. And that in itself is already very powerful to live your life despite the burdens of capitalism. Next, I'm going to talk about what is the tendency of being a middle class. Okay, our side argues that materialistic wealth has a certain toxicity in which it enables people to continuously want it and continuously never feel better. But the opening government argues that material wealth is already a necessity to living in a capitalist structure, and that at the end of the day, if you do not aggressively pursue, then you can never ever even self-sustain yourself. We feel first that is self-contradictory towards their claim, because most of their assertions in the beginning was to assert that living as a middle life, then ultimately your life is already self-sustained with all of the many safety nets that Social Security has, with all the many safety nets that, for example, you get access to capital, you get access to investment, that Stephanie already said. But at the end of the day, Rifan tried to argue that if you do not aggressively pursue, if you do not trade Bitcoin, then suddenly you're not going to have a life, and suddenly you're going to need to aggressively pursue again, right? If your world is a world in which so much chaos happens, in which just a day you can get poor and you to aggressively pursue to not get poor again, then that further intensifies our first assertion that it is inherently still unfair, right? At the end of the day, which is why we're very proud to oppose. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for the Deputy Leader of Opposition, and thank you very much indeed for the opening half of this debate. Proceeding swiftly to the closing half, inviting Member of Government to open the case for CG, please. You're here.
Yeah, so if anybody has like POI, I would just either you hold that POI sign thing on your video, or like just tell me. Like, don't use the chat. I can't see it.
Gotcha.
Okay. So the contribution of closing government is one, we're going to bite the bullet if we never climb the ladder at all, and what if we never become richer? If we're going to live the rest of our lives working our ass off and being miserable with aggressively pursuing materialism, why this pursuit is a responsibility for an average middle class and not just done for practical reasons. This directly engages with the idea of fulfillment coming from the opening opposition, why even if it brings us fulfillment better in their side of the house, it's still not okay for us to pursue mediocrity and minimal sustainability. Second of all, I'm going to talk about when do we have the responsibility to sacrifice materialistic pursuit. We're going to analyze what fixed capitalistic structure means in the motion, because that is something that the opening debate never really talked about. So our setup is mainly the same, right? But what we mean by aggressive is not just like trading or self-fulfillment, but we would also want to seize every possible opportunity, like having a pragmatic loyalty to whom you can gain most benefits from, resorting to flattery to your bosses, taking opportunities away from your close friends, abandoning old morally right projects for new projects that bring more benefit. We imagine a world where we only do things that are nice to others when we also have something to gain from it, like clout or recognition, things that can turn into material goods. So all the rebuttal coming from opposition will be integrated in my argument, but we also think that when the closing government case comes into fruition, we don't think the argument coming from opening opposition will be important anymore. My first argument will be talking about who does an average middle class work for and why we have the responsibility to continue pursuing material goods, right? We think that most average middle class are living a regular idea of what is a sufficiently fulfilling lifestyle, which is a small family with kids, right? Most likely these are the people who don't have intergenerational wealth, and thus their parents most likely don't have enough money to sustain their lives after they retire. We imagine an average middle class will have to sustain not just themselves, but their children and their parents at old age as well, right? So what's the problem? I think the opening has a very optimistic characterization of middle class. We think the middle class has the widest spectrum of characterization in the world. We think that in Indonesia, for example, people who earn minimum salary can be categorized as middle class because they have enough without needing government help, but not necessarily but they are not necessarily the people who hold managerial positions. For example, they're not the people who have tenures and have like job security, like the opening government would like you to believe. We think that these are your average corporate workers, and a lot of them don't necessarily have job security. Middle class people don't all take managerial positions. They might be a part of sales team, for example, or a secretarial staff, jobs that are replaceable and is prone to be taken away during economic recessions. These are the people who graduate from college or high school and might not get a job because the limited job opportunity, even if their degree might be useful, right? These are the people who don't necessarily make enough to make investments in stocks or have enough for savings and insurance, most likely because they make the bare minimum and will have to spend their monthly earnings to pay for monthly rent and food, right? The conclusion is they don't have job security as well as the opening debate would like you to believe. And it's not even happiness that we need to talk about. Our survivability can be taken away from us at any time. And this is something that we think the opening debate has never considered, the fact that survivability can be taken away from us at any time. So knowing this, why do we have the responsibility to continue aggressively pursuing materialistic gains, right? We think that there are other actors that we need to be responsible for. For example, parents and children, the people who are very close to us, too precious, the people that we cannot sacrifice for anything that we want to pursue, be it self-fulfillment or materialistic gains. Most likely these are the people who need a lot of who cannot work for themselves. For example, our children who are not adult enough to have a job yet, for example, or our parents who have retired, right? We imagine our income would be used to spend not only for ourselves, but also for the healthcare of our children, for example, the education of our children that only gets more and more expensive. The fact that even after education, and having like a full degree, your children's job in the future might not be secure as well, and they might need our help in the future, right? We think that this is why we have to aggressively pursue materialistic gain, even if it will not bring us personal happiness, but even to engage the opening opposition's idea better. We think that when it comes to self-fulfillment, if what they think of self-fulfillment is a very like minimalistically content life, we think that in order to be anything close to happy, you need to be able to make sure that you're not personally guilty for whatever happens to your children and your parents and your family leaders. The fact that you are going to live a self-fulfilling life and sacrifice materialistic gain just because you want to be content in like whatever religion you want to pursue or whatever passion you want to pursue, and in the process you sacrifice your children and the security of your parents' healthcare, we think that you're going to feel even way worse, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why we think that the responsibility is better fulfilled in our side of the house. But the second analysis, right, something that the opening debates never really talked about, what does it mean to be in a fixed capitalist structure a condition where you can never move out of the capitalistic system, right? We think that, and I'm going to answer this analysis with a question, which is, when is there a responsibility to sacrifice materialistic gains for morality? We think that you only have the responsibility to lead a minimally sustaining lifestyle when you know there is a chance to change capitalism, ladies and gentlemen. We think that when society collectively believes that sacrificing materialistic goods is worth it for a more equal society where everyone has equal income, for example, where everyone has equal access to education and healthcare, that's the only time you have the responsibility or the motivation to not aggressively pursue materialistic gains. What does this look like? This looks like, for example, rich people donating the majority of their wealth to be content with minimum fulfillment, rigorous distribution through taxes, or like middle class people thinking that it's okay if their opportunities are taken away by other people who might need it more, or like it's okay if I don't earn as much as long as we become a more equal society, right? It's because of two reasons. First of all, it's because everyone collectively needs to start being content without materialism to have a more socialist society or a less capitalistic one. And two, second reason is one of the main enjoyment of living a regularly content life is because there is hope that one day it's all going to be for a bigger purpose, which is changing the society from a capitalistic structure to a more socialist one, or to make a society that is more equal for everyone, right? In a world where it's absolutely not possible to move out from capitalism, we no longer have the responsibility nor the motivation to start being content for everything else that comes after our death, right? Because a lot of the times when you want to sacrifice materialistic goods, your motivation is that it's not going to make you very fulfilled in this current life, but it's going to be for a better purpose in the future, ladies and gentlemen. For example, if you were to aggressively pursue materialistic gains, but not for you, but for your kids, for example, you work extra hard so that you can get a lot of savings and make sure that your children can live well off in the future. It's most of the time not for something that you can gain in the current in your current life, but it is for something in the future. Knowing that you can never move out from the capitalistic structure, like the motion says, it is no longer possible for you to live a content lifestyle for something bigger, and that's why closing government proposes.
Beans, thank you very much for member of government for that speech. To continue opposition's case and specifically opening the case for closing opposition's behalf, I'd like to invite the member of opposition to speak, please. You're here.
Yes, am I audible?
Yep, good.
Members of the House, I think the missing context that is happening in the opening debate and to some extent to closing government is actually the most obvious part of the debate, which is the emphasis on the material possession in itself, material possession that is tangible. This debate is not as simple as whether or not you want to work really, really hard in government side of the House and not working at all in opposition side of the House, right? Because in government side of the House, when you want to focus on material possession, that's the moment when you are going to channel most of your money to buy material that is very, very tangible. Things such as properties, cars, fancy handbags, not as simple as trading shares, for example, in your side of the House. The question we're going to answer in closing opposition is why then it is so bad for middle class to see this as the ultimate purpose of life, seeing this as, you know, buying handbags that is fancy, for example, buying as many apartment units as possible as the most important purpose in your life in government side of the House. So what are we going to do in closing opposition, right? I think it's clear what is the alternative in opposition side of the House. Just because we live life of mediocrity, it does not mean that we stop working in our side of the House. We still work in opposition side of the House. But the question of the debate is, what are we going to do with the money we earn every month, ladies and gentlemen? In our side of the House, we are going to consider multiple values in making financial decision, right? For example, we are going to save save our money. We are not going to use it for material possession, like what's going to happen in governments out of the house. We are going to create a safety net, financial security for our family. So we are more than happy to have minimalist lifestyle, for example, to engage in spiritualism, to meditate every morning because you don't want to buy things that is fancy, for example. So in our side of the house, we are more than happy to deprioritize the idea of materialism value. Two questions in my speech. Number one, I'm going to tell you about financial security. Second of all, the survivability of middle class. But before that, one quick rebuttal to closing government, right? So the main idea of closing government is that as a middle class, we are responsible to work as hard as we can to save our family, to save our children, and so on, right? The thing is, in our side of the house, we are still responsible too, right? Because we are still working as well in opposition side of the house. It's not like we stop working in opposition. We still work reasonably. The difference is in government side of the house, when you continue the life of materialistic lifestyle, that's the moment. The way you help your children is by buying them stuff, buying them the newest iPhone, for example, buying them fancy handbags, and so on, right? But in our side of the house, the incentive is going to be different. We are still responsible to them, but the way we become responsible to them is by providing things that is not always material, such as providing more financial security in terms of saving, for example, in terms of providing them education that is not always tangible and that is not always materialistic in our side of the house. So that way, the idea of responsibility is going to be much more sustainable in our side of the house when you don't always provide them with the idea of material goods in our side of the house. So yeah, that's for closing government. First question, and yeah, my extension regarding financial security. Yeah, before that, sure.
Do you think that money does not count as material goods?
It is different, right? Because no, it's different because when you are talking about money, it's about money is the currency that we are using, and the question of the debate is how are you going to manifest that money? How are you going to translate the use of the money in itself, right? It's unfair for government to completely say that we are not going to pursue any money at all in our side of the house. By that logic, people in opposition side of the house are going to die. So that's not how the debate should be working, right? So the first question regarding financial security, right? I think government side of the house has been very making scenario that is too convenient for them, right? They're only pursuing materialism in general, but they are not aggressively doing it actually in government side of the house. Because when you want to do it aggressively, it means you are going to do it in a frequency that is very high. Every 6 months, for example, you are going to acquire new property. Every 6 months, for example, you are going to buy new gadget that is very overpriced, for example, right? And you are going to do it in a constant way. This is exactly what opening government said, right? You have multiple influence coming from advertisements, social circles, and so on and so forth. The consequence of this particular context is that sometimes your decision to purchase material goods in government side of the house will often be irrational too, ladies and gentlemen. So it's not always you make a rational purchase at all times in government side of the house, and that's the moment you are going to compromise your survivability and other needs because you spend most of your time translating your money into things that is always material. But in our side of the house, it's not going to be like that. Why is it bad? Rifan said that middle class is going to be captured because we are a huge part of the market segmentation and so on. It's not true. Maybe we are part of the huge market segmentation, but they don't always make goods affordable for middle class. People can buy iPhone, but they have to sacrifice themselves using credit card, for example, opting into cicilan like home credit and so on, right? They can purchase it, but they will be struggling, right? Because this is the way capitalism works. They want to make middle class can buy it, but middle class still have to struggle for it because that way, corporation is going to acquire as many profit as they can, right? So in our side of the house, it's going to be different because the money that you earn from working, for example, it's going to be allocated to savings, right? So maybe we can be, maybe in our side of the house, we are less like, we are slightly poorer, but at least the money in itself can be used as a safety net, right? Why then this is bad? Because if you purchase goods, even if it is very expensive in government side of the house, things such as property, things such as lands and handbags that is very fancy, not all of them are liquid. So it cannot always be easily turned into money, right? So you might have a lot of cars, you might have a lot of properties, but when financial crisis hits, for example, externalities such as pandemics, it's not always transferable to to money, right? That's the moment when you don't have any emergency fund in government side of the house, especially using the context of closing government as well. You as a middle class, you don't have any job security, you don't have enough disposable income, and you don't have any inheritance, right? So that way, in your side of the house, you exactly jeopardize the survivability of the middle class. And this also leads me nicely to my second issue, right? Regarding what will happen to middle class in our side of the house, right? So a refund question asks, what will happen to middle class if they don't aggressively pursue materialism, right? Because healthcare is still very, very expensive and so on. First of all, like what I told you in my first extension, right? We still have savings, right? And in most countries, I think it is reasonable for government to still have program for middle class because we are a huge political blocks for the government. But second of all, when you live in a life of mediocrity, you are less exposed to risk. There is less chance for you to be depressed because now you have room to pursue your passion and so on. So the degree of happiness that you have in our side of the house is slightly bigger. But third of all, I think non-materialistic good is inherently much more cheaper, right? Spirituality, for example, having a Zen life, doing yoga in your house, it's very, very cheap. I think in our side of the house, the survivability of middle class is going to be deconstructed, and it is so much better than in government side of the house. We oppose. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for member of opposition to that speech. To conclude the case for closing government, I'd like to invite government whip to speak, please. Here.
Oh, yeah. If you guys want to POI, just interrupt me or using signs because I won't see the chat. Am I audible, by the way? We think that the opening debate in general suffers for unclear lines of parameter, right? Because we think both things that they try to propose is two things: happiness and ability to climb the social ladder, happiness and ability to be successful in either becoming a monk and live in a very reclusive area, or you want to be a part of the capitalistic society. But none of them are valid because it's very, very dependent of external factors of your luck and your capacity, for example, to feel to deal with the stress of doing capital work from 9 to 5 and constantly need to prove yourself, and also the feel that you're not going to succumb to the demand of society that wants you to be successful and you'll always be happy in your reclusive life. We think that this is a very, very uncertain parameter because it really depends on those people, and we cannot generalize all of them to have the same kind of parameter. That's why we don't think that this is the best parameter to go, right? We think that the only parameter that are able to be achieved in this debate is responsibility, right? The fact that even if you're not going to be successful, at the very least, you try to be responsible for people who already make sure that you're successful in life because you're the first generation to go to college, for example, is the most important thing to defend because it's the only way you can survive in this world, ladies and gentlemen. So that's what we're trying to aiming for, and that's the role of CG in this debate, right? But secondly, we think that CO comes into this debate and bring you a very unneeded clarifications because they told you on how that being materialistic equals to only consumptive behavior. They talk about they want to provide good financial decisions and also educations. But what you need to understand, these both are a means to gain material goods, ladies and gentlemen. So it's also basically concluded as a part of being aggressive to achieve materialistic goods. So we don't understand that what's the difference they're going to take because they just prove that it's important for us to do this, right? We think the wording of the motion told you that you need to pursue it aggressively. So it doesn't necessarily translate into only want to become hedonistic, for examples, because especially it's not achievable in the sense that you're aggressive, that you're middle class, ladies and gentlemen. Of course, the parameter is going to be different than when you're rich, right? So we don't think that is actually good for them to clarify this, right? But second of all, we think that at the end of the day, I'm going to engage to how the life of mediocrity would look like and whether it will still bring happiness towards them in this debate, right? So moving on, I'm going to talk about two things. I'm going to talk about how it will impact them is I'm going to talk about life of mediocrity, and then secondly, I'm going to talk about the well-being of the people, right? So first of all, the life of mediocrity. This is basically both things that are defended by the whole bench of oppositions, right? They want to be an average Joe. They want to just do job whatever it is. They don't want to do any more. They don't want to be aggressive and don't want to overwork themselves. But what you need to understand is, who are this average Joe, right? What are their works, right? We're talking about factory workers. We're talking about people who dwell into corporate work, sales, for management team, things like that. What does it mean? This clarification is important because in order for them to maintain their job in a very competitive market that a lot of people offer a lot of things, ladies and gentlemen, a lot of people are becoming more competitive in work field. They, in order to be average Joe, they also need to be aggressive, ladies and gentlemen, in pursuing those jobs in order for them not to be easily replaceable by other people that offer them less wages, for example. We live in this kind of world right now, so it's weird for them to want to be average Joe, but not doing it aggressively. What are we talking about? We're talking about you as a factory workers need to hiss after your supervisor and shows that you're a hard worker by continuously you're working above your working time, for example, in order for you to prove that you're a worthy people to invest on, you're a worthy worker to invest upon by your bosses, for example. So we think that those also a form of aggressive move that they need to do in order to attain the average Joe and life of mediocrity, ladies and gentlemen. That's why at the end of the day, we don't understand how then they're going to achieve their happy life when they wanted to become those kind of people, because it's essentially the same. They just justify the reasons why they need to be average Joe. Most likely what's going to happen under their side of the house is they're going to become so poor because they're unable to compete with other people with other people that give them other benefit of hiring them as a worker, ladies and gentlemen, because they do not want to become aggressive. And this is not only bad for themselves, but also bad for other people, such as when they want to create family, for example. It's bad for their children because they cannot attain the proper educations to make a different decision with their parents. For example, if their children wanted to have a luxurious life, they cannot do that, and they completely minimize the ability for their children to do that because it's going to extend into the next generation, ladies and gentlemen. So at the end of the day, life of mediocrity is not an option to begin with when you live in this, when you live in a fixed capitalistic society. We don't understand how it's going to manifest as happiness under their side of the house, and this is important because that's basically the only thing that they dwell upon in this debate, right? But secondly, talking about the well-being of the people. So they told you on how that they want to live a happy life because happiness that they're taking at the opposite side is going to be beneficial because it's going to be direct and there's not going to be pressure. Ladies and gentlemen, when you reveal like reclassive life, what's going to happen is the happiness that you feel is going to be very, very short term. Why? Because most likely, the actor that we're talking about is average Joe, like people who are in a middle class, right? What does it mean? It means that before you have the decision to go and pursue life in a reclusivity, you most likely already work, and you most likely your peers comes from middle class, your family comes from middle class. Why is this characteristic important? It's important because when you try to go on with your life, with your decisions, we're going to come to family meeting and constantly being pinned down, questions by people around you why you choose to do this, and therefore you're going to question your decision making, ladies and gentlemen. You're going to feel bad because you don't feel that you're enough, because there's other people such as your brother or your sister, for example, showcase the proper figure of people of average middle class who live in a society and live a successful life because they choose to compete on it and become aggressive on it. But your parents, for example, are going to question why you do this, why you sacrifice a lot of things in your plate when it's not giving you too much, ladies and gentlemen. We think that this kind of pressure will come to you in a very constant manner. That's why you're going to question and not feel happy in a long time because you question your decision whether it's right or wrong, because essentially there's very little minimum of people who think that this life is good, right? We think that's most likely is a very niche of people who thinks that. Therefore, it's lessly for you to gain support from your decision. But more than that, we think that well-being or your fulfillment is extended not only to yourself but also to people, to next generation, right? When you're able to go first generation to go to college and you're able to go work that pays you money, it becomes beneficial for your children and your family also. So we think that it's going to be a different type of fulfillment. There's going to be good for you to propose.
Okay, thank you very much for the government whip for that speech. And to close CEO's case and the debate as a whole, inviting opposition to speak, please. Here.
Can you all hear me?
Yep. Good.
Okay. Great. Ladies and gentlemen, we agree that perhaps capitalism is inevitable in our current world, as the motion says, a fixed capitalism. But just because it's fixed and inevitable does not automatically mean that you have to actively participate and adjust to such actions. You might pursue your job in charity or NGO related for nonprofits, even though they are highly conflicting with philanthrocapitalists, for example, but you don't have to actively pursue that and you don't have to aggressively participate in that. Just because you can pursue means in religious means, happiness in religious means, and even though they are highly conflating with the prosperity gospel, does not mean that you have to be actively complicit on that. And that is the clear stance that opposition are willing to defend in this debate. Because this debate is not just about embracing capitalism in general, but this debate ought to be in the form of a question of why then the form of embracing capitalism ought to be in the form of possessing material needs. And closing opposition says that the possession of material needs is not a strategic investment for the middle class individuals. That's the question we'll answer. I have three things to say in my speech. First, I'm going to talk about this hate-love relationship between capitalism and middle class. Second of all, I'm going to talk about financial security, Hanum's most important extension that Balk is clearly dismissed. Thirdly, I'm going to compare the worst case scenario and assume that in our world, we live a very mediocre life, not having much profits, just a standard life, why we think it's more preferable than pursuing materialism. But before going to those three issues, I have a couple of things to address to closing government. Closing government, talk about two things. First, let's talk about the responsibility they really wanted to champion, right? Hanum tells you in our world, just because we are having a standard life does not mean we're not working to be responsible for our family. But I'm going to extend this and say, even if we are not responsible for our parents and for the children or for our brothers and sisters, we think it's perfectly fine. Why? Because we live in a world we're not consented to live in such family structure that are middle class, in such family structure that have parents that are not able anymore to pursue or to have jobs. We're not consented to live with our brothers and sisters. We're not consented to live and to be born in this particular family. That's why we don't think that we bear such responsibility to begin with, because we're not consented to live in such structures in the first place. Second of all, I'm just going to clarify this argument about competition, right? In capitalistic world, competition is necessary, and there will always be people that are going to lose. Because if there's no one going to lose, then that's not absolutely competition, right? The question that we impose in closing opposition is that in competition, and when you have wasted so much of your resources, your agencies and your financial security, what are they going to do in government side of the house? So that is the question that they haven't been able to pursue, because they continuously say, you have to compete, you have to compete. But what if you lost in that competition? There is some marginal harms that closing opposition are not willing to defend. Not yet. First question, let's talk about capitalism and middle class individuals. Because opening government seems to believe that capitalism is not friendly to middle class. That's why we have to incorporate that so that we are able to some sort of live our life with capitalism and dominate against only the rich in the past. Number one, their policy is highly contingent on middle class capable out of dominating the stock markets, being able to acquire the most property in order for capitalism to be in favor of the middle class. As long as their policy cannot prove that, they cannot possibly win the debate. The unfortunate reality, capitalism will always favor the rich, and middle class will always be put behind the rich people. So rich people get the first class. Second of all, yes, you might get some degree of benefits, right? For example, you get some benefits of the liquidation of shares that you acquire through stocks market. You get the benefit from your property. But the problem is that there's two scenarios. One, in worst case, there's also two possible scenarios. That one, in worst case, the effect of market volatility, the effect of pandemic, and the effect of crisis might result into you not being able to manifest their benefit. Or second, in a moderate case, The benefit that you can accrue from the acquiring of property will manifest in 10 to 15 years and not manifest right after that. The problem is those who can benefit in the meantime are not the middle class. The middle class can't bear the consequences of all of the harms that already exist on those meantimes of waiting for the uncertain benefits that OG is willing to defend on that side of the house. In our proposal, living in mediocre life necessarily means that you have less of a needs. That means you are less exposed to all of the dangers, less exposed to all of the risks that they are willing to have on that side of the house. So the conclusion is that the benefit you can accrue from capitalistic structures, from a fixed capitalistic structure, is questionable. But the harms that you get from actively involving in capitalistic structure is unquestionable, and that's not something we're willing to defend. No. Second question, let's talk about financial security. And this is the most important contributions that we give to you. The motion says aggressively pursuing material possession. When it says aggressive, sometimes it doesn't take into account multiple factors that can affect the material possession. Aggressive means you need to pursue it rush in a huge amount and continuously, be it by working hard, like what Oji said, or continuously spending your money to property, stock markets, and whatever the acquired of wealth. The problem is that the calculation, when you are continuously being aggressive, it may not be very careful and does not take into consideration multiple factors. Meanwhile, the decision in financial ought to be very careful and considerate, Madam Speaker. So we don't necessarily think that it's a rational investment that middle class ought to pursue. This is the most important argument because they never say why an aggressive pursuit of material possession is strategic investment for middle class. We don't think so. There's a lot of externalities that affect in material possession, and that is why acquiring material wealth is not something that's beneficial for middle class. Second, we told you the capitalistic structure trapped middle class in the illusion of accessibility. They trap you as if you can afford to buy a house, you can afford to buy a car, but the means to achieve that, they trap you in loans, they trap you in credit card, they trap you in taking 2 to 3 jobs to the extent that you lost out of your agency. These are the harms that we're not willing to defend in our set of house. What is the worst case comparative? In our world, living a mediocre life, pursuing a mediocre achievement in your life, pursuing your passions, even if it's non-profit, is preferable because you are less exposed to a high risk in government side of the house. Basically, a simple concept of high risk, high return. But the possibility of high return is still questionable. In our world, when you are less riskier and become much more careful in living a mediocre life, you are not exposing yourself to a lot of the harms that capitalism injects in the first place. That is why we're saving the middle class in our side. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opposition whip, and thank you very much indeed for all speakers for what was an exciting debate for a Sunday morning. I'd like to invite all of you to virtually cross floor, shake hands, and